Studying the end times, frankly, can be kind of crazy. I mean, anytime you start to discuss the end times or even try to do some sort of Bible study on the end times, it gets flooded with all kinds of theories about pre-trib and mid-trib and post-trib and no-trib or all kinds of discussions about the Antichrist, or sometimes even people looking up to the sky and they're going, I think there's blood red moons or there's an eclipse on the Passover. And studying the end times can be exhausting, confusing, overwhelming. But one of the things that I've noticed is all of our conversations, all of the things we spend our time on, especially in regards to end times, is governed by our questions. The questions that we bring usually dictate the conversations that we have. And when it comes to the end times, we come with a bag of questions that usually are pretty standard across the board. Questions like, when will the world end? Or are we living in the end times? When will Jesus come back? What will heaven look like? Who is the Antichrist? These are usually this type of questions that swirl around and take this gift from Scripture into an absolute crazy, confusing mess that sometimes even plagues the church in the present. To those questions, they're all understandable. I want to ask a different question. A question that's going to frame our entire study here. Here it is. Do our questions match the Bible's questions? Like when it comes to studying the end times, do the questions that we are asking match the questions that the Bible is asking or that the Bible is trying to answer whenever it is discussing end times things? And let me just give you a hint when it comes to the questions of the Bible. When the Bible's discussing end times, its questions are intent on curing homesickness. Homesickness is powerful. It's powerful, and it has an ability to take us away from the present into a different time and a different location. You know, I get the privilege of teaching freshmen here at Ozark Christian College. And man, every year in the fall, when the freshmen come, that first 3 weeks or so, it is so wonderful. I mean, everybody's excited. Everybody's diving into their classes, into dorm life. And then around week 4, the honeymoon is over. All of a sudden, you start to have a little bit of, maybe a little disagreement here and there, maybe the strain of the syllabus, but what starts to surface is about 15 to 20% of the freshmen start to become homesick, deeply homesick. And whenever I'm pastoring students through that, my number one goal is to help them fend off the temptation to be longing so much for a different location that they fail to be present in the here and now, that they fail to see the gifts that are right in front of them, to see the work that is right in front of them, to see the calling of God that is in the here and now, in the present. And here's the reality. All of us, ever since Genesis 3, all of us have a dose of homesickness embedded into our souls. We know we were not made for this place or this time. We know we were made for Eden more than the world that is east of Eden. And we long to be back into the presence of our Lord. We long to be in this place called heaven. And it is natural during the times of suffering, the times of strain, the times of turmoil. It is natural to long to be in a different place. A place where there is no more crying, and there is no more mourning, and there is no more death. But when the Bible talks about end times, it doesn't merely create these pictures that ignite our homesickness. It intends to cure the homesickness, not by looking at the future, but by allowing the future to root you in the present. You see, the study of end times, and this will take a mental shift, The study of end times is less about the future and what will happen, and it is more about the present and how you are living today. What I want to do is I want us to dive into 3 key texts of end times type discussions in the Bible. 3 key texts. The first text is going to be Matthew chapters 24 and 25. This text will really be focusing on the second coming of Jesus. Then I want us to take a look at Revelation chapters 21 and 22, where we see this gorgeous picture of heaven. And then I want us to end by looking at 2 Peter chapter 3, where we see this powerful image of fire coming onto the earth and reconfiguring it, remaking it, making it new. And one of the things you will notice is that every single one of these, even though they are looking at something that is in the end times, they are all intending to get the audience to be rooted in the present, not distracted by the future. Let's dive in. Matthew chapters 24 and 25. We're actually going to begin in verse 36. In verse 36, Jesus just kind of dispels all mystery. You know, that question that we have of when will the end come? When is Jesus' second coming going to happen? He just says it flat out in verse 36. About that day or hour, no one knows. Not the angels in heaven, not even the Son, but only the Father. You know, whenever Jesus says something that bluntly, that blatantly, kind of like love your enemies, maybe we should obey it. Stop trying to spend our time focusing on the when, and instead focus on what it is that this text is trying to get us to pay attention to. You see, after Jesus in verse 36 says, no one has a clue when the second coming is going to happen, he then moves into 4 parables, 4 successive parables. And each of the parables has the same message. No one stinking knows, so always be ready. No one has a clue when the second coming is happening. So make sure you are ready when it happens unexpectedly. As a matter of fact, verse 42 says that. It says, therefore keep watch. Since no one knows, keep watch. Because you don't know on what day the Lord will come. And then look down at verse 46. Oh, it will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing good when he returns. No one knows. Make sure you are ready by what you're doing. The first parable is in verses 47 through 51. It's the parable of the wicked servant, who's the master leaves this servant in charge of the other servants, and he starts to maliciously beat them. And when the master comes back unexpectedly, he deals harshly with that wicked servant. No one knows the day or hour. Always be stinking ready. Then comes the second parable, chapter 25, verses 1 through 13, the parable of the 10 virgins, where the 10 virgins are waiting for the bridegroom to come. 5 of them are wise servants. Verse 4, the wise ones took oil in jars along with their lamps, making sure they had enough to wait for as long as the bridegroom was going to delay. But then there's 5 foolish ones, and they do not take enough oil. And then in the middle of the night, they get the announcement, the bridegroom is coming. The 5 wise virgins grab all of their preparations and start to move whenever the 5 foolish ones say, hey, give us some of your oil. And they're like, no, there's not enough for all of us. Go buy some. But the problem is, when the 5 foolish ones go and buy the oil, it is at that time the bridegroom comes back and the doors are closed and they miss the party. No one knows when he's coming back. Always be stinking ready by what you do. Third parable of the talents, Matthew 25, 14 through 30. It is this very clear parable of a master giving gifts, 5, 2, and 1, bags of gold, these talents to his servants. And he's going to be away. And each of them responds with this gift in a very different way. He comes back unexpectedly. And he finds the first one has doubled what was given. The second one has doubled. But then comes the third one, who the third one says in verses 24 and 25, I knew you were a hard man and you harvest where you have not sown and gathered. So I was scared. I just buried it. And then listen to what the master says in verse 26. "You wicked, lazy servant." See, lazy is a word that has to do with not doing things. You see, the master went away, and they didn't know when he was going to return, but he gave them gifts in order for them to do things in preparation for when he came back. And you don't want to be caught doing nothing. Verse 20, or chapter 25, verses 31 through 46 is the fourth parable. And the fourth parable is going to continue the same theme as the first three. This parable, though, is the parable of the sheep and the goats. You know this one? Verse 31, the Son of Man comes in his glory. He sits on his glorious throne, and he separates the nations into sheep and goats, the faithful and the unfaithful. And notice in verse 34, when he's talking to those that have been faithful, notice what he lists as evidence of their faithfulness. It says, then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world." Listen to this, verse 35. "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." You see, Matthew chapters 24 and 25 is talking about the second coming, but it is not answering the questions that we typically ask of the text. When is Jesus coming back? It says very clearly, no one knows. But instead of being obsessed of what is going to happen in the future, this is what it says. He is coming. So start planting your seeds today. Be ready so that when he comes, you have a harvest. You see, a lot of the times when we talk about the end times, we are obsessed about the future. But the Bible, when it speaks of the end times, it is focused on how we are living in the present. Revelation chapter 21 and 22 is no different. It's just that this time, instead of the second coming, we are focused on heaven. Oh, what a glorious way to end the last two chapters of the Bible. Chapter 21 of Revelation, verse 1, "A new heaven and a new earth are coming because the first heaven and the first earth has passed away. And the holy city is coming down out of heaven," verse 2, "as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband." And then in verse 3, God gets excited. He says, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them, and he will be their God." And then verse 4, one of the things that stirs our hearts with homesickness. It says, "And he will wipe every tear from their eyes. There'll be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." Oh my goodness, we are definitely in the context of the end times. This is what we were made for, heaven. And that's why it's not surprising when we get to chapter 22 that we see in verse 2, on each side of the river stood the tree of life. The tree of life that we saw in Genesis 2 and 3. We are back in Eden. We are back in communion with God. We are in heaven. But here's what's interesting. There is a verse that begins chapter 21 at the very end of chapter 20. And a verse at the end of chapter 22 that bookends this image of heaven. These two verses that actually function as the beginning and the end so that it actually characterizes everything in the middle. Listen to chapter 20, verse 12. We are in the image there of the great white throne judgment, where the judgment of the evil and the good, like Matthew 25, is now present. But listen to this, verse 12. "The dead were judged according to what they had done, as recorded in the books." This context of how you're living matters when you get to anything in the end, characterizes all that follows, and it climaxes in chapter 22, verse 12. Jesus is speaking. He says, "Look, I am coming soon. My reward is with me, and I will give each person according to what they have done." This is very typical of the New Testament, of the Bible, that when it comes to end times texts, it is always in the context of ethics, of how you are living today. Yeah, we may not know when he is coming, but you better always stinking be ready. How are we ready? Because we need to be paying attention to how we are living now. And what's really fascinating is that 2 Peter chapter 3 drives this same thing home in a very clear way. 2 Peter chapter 3, Peter is talking to this church who's being attacked by these scoffers, is what he calls them in chapter 3, verse 3. These scoffers that are making fun of them. They're asking this question, verse 4, where is this coming that your Lord promised? When is the second coming gonna occur? Where is it? It seems like it's taken quite a little bit of time. Maybe he forgot about you. Peter looks at him and he says, listen. He didn't forget about us. As a matter of fact, he says in verse 8, do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. God just doesn't measure time the way that we do. And then he says this in verse 9. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, in keeping his unfolding of the second coming and of heaven. He's not slow in keeping that promise, as some understand slowness, verse 9. Instead, he's patient with you because he doesn't want anyone to perish, but he wants everyone to come to repentance. And then listen to verse 10. This is intense imagery. But the day of the Lord, a conversation we've been having in the first two texts, the day of the Lord will come like a thief. You don't know when it's going to happen. The heavens will disappear with a roar. The elements will be destroyed by fire, and the earth and everything done in it will be laid bare. And then listen to verse 11. Listen to the question that Peter asks in the context of end times. Since everything will be destroyed in this way, what kind of people ought you to be? Do our questions about the end times match the questions that the Bible is asking about the end times? Because most of the time when it comes to the end times, we are asking questions about when will the world end, or when will Jesus come back, or are we living in the last days, or what will heaven look like? And I understand why those questions matter to us. We have this deep homesickness. But whenever the Bible is talking about end times things, it's not obsessing over questions that cannot be answered. It is not focused merely on the cure, although it wants to let us know that is happening. It is focused on fixing the homesickness by rooting us in the present, not to be distracted by the future, but to be rooted in the here and now. Because since we know it's going to happen, and since we know the beauty of what it is, here's what the Bible is asking. So then how ought you to live today? As people that merely peer into the sky, looking for the signs to come together, how are you to live today? Every time the Bible speaks of end times, it is always asking the question, in light of this, how ought you to be? How ought you to live? How should you respond today? And let me just say this. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 9 through 13, we call it the Lord's Prayer. You've probably heard it before. It begins with, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And then he says this. This is his request. In teaching us how to pray, this is what Jesus requests. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Let me pull this together. When it comes to end times, a lot of the times we're asking questions, trying to crack the code of what is heaven and when will heaven be here. But whenever the Bible talks about the end times, this is what it's doing. It's saying, church, you are heaven on earth, so start acting like it. And if we embrace this question and this message, the end times doesn't become filled with crazy and confusion. It becomes filled with conviction. Do our questions match the Bible's questions? Because in light of all of this, here's what I want to leave you with. If all of this is true, how should you be living today? And maybe answering that question will not only cure homesickness, but a lot of other diseases that are ransacking this world.